Thank you very much for having me here to share my thoughts about the impact of COVID-19 on the education industry. And I'm going to look at this from a number of multiple angles. The impact of COVID-19 has certainly been far-reaching and has impacted all of us in different ways. And as we've heard from the previous speakers, it's all, of course, impacted different industries in different ways as well. So professionally, as a tertiary educator and consultant, this pandemic will definitely have an impact on the research that I do around generations that we're educating, the future of education, of course, as well as the skills that future talent actually needs. More practically, actually, what's interesting is that after having, as you said, teaching for 12 years in universities, I had to deliver my first online lecture for my university elective at CBS the morning after the lockdown was announced here in Denmark about slightly over a month ago. And it was certainly a very strange experience as an educator to deliver a lecture to a computer screen and not actually being able to interact with my students in the same way that I'd been used to all these years. I also look at this issue as a board member of a large international school here in Denmark, to see how strategically this pandemic would actually impact educational institutions as we plan for the future as well. More personally, I think I look at this as a mother of two primary school children who've had a number of weeks of remote learning at home and who have actually just returned to school. We've opened schools here in Denmark, primary schools here last week, in an environment, and they're being educated in an environment that looks very different from what they've been used to, with many strict and obviously necessary social distancing measures. According to the UNESCO statistics, there are about 1.38 billion students worldwide who are actually not going to school or universities right now. And about 1/3 of the global population is actually under lockdown because of the virus. So this has, of course, forced educators in kindergartens as well as all the way to universities to really think differently and adapt in the ways that we actually deliver education to our students. What is interesting in the education industry is that for a while now, there's been a lot of discussion about the need for educators to rethink how we educate and what we're educating our students for, to find new ways to prepare students for the fourth industrial revolution. So COVID-19 has certainly disrupted the education industry and has impacted it in many ways. And we can see educators around the world embracing and trying their best to find creative ways of educating students under these lockdown conditions. So before we get into how COVID could impact the education industry, I think it's really important for us to know who we're educating. In our schools and universities at the moment, we have students from Generation Z as well as Generation Alpha. And the members of Gen Z and Alpha are part of the mobile first and technology saturated generations, in which social media is definitely their lifeline, and they have strong expectations for instantaneous as well as communication as well as feedback. And Gen Z is often known as the YouTube generation, with Instagram being perhaps the most popular app of this generation. 58% of Gen Z actually own a tablet computer. 57% of Gen Z actually own a desktop computer, and they spend about 3 hours a day on average on social media. And this is, of course, a generation that is motivated by purpose-driven action and are deeply concerned with social as well as environmental issues around sustainability and climate change, diversity and inclusion, as well as mental health. And they see the need to really work collaboratively to be able to address these issues. So as the world thinks about how this pandemic will impact various industries, I would really like us in the educational industry to really take this opportunity to redefine what normal will look like. So let's take a look at how COVID-19 could potentially impact the education industry. So firstly, I think it's really made us in the education industry think differently about how we deliver education. So about 60% of the global population is online, was online prior to the pandemic. And governments, publishers, technology providers, and network operators have had to work in partnership to actually enable educators to provide asynchronous as well as synchronous education online to as many students globally as possible. So we've heard of efforts in the US, in New Zealand, and the UK by various parties to provide laptops, tablet, and mobile hotspots even to enable remote learning to actually happen. So this remote learning environment has meant that educators have had to think really creatively about how we create content in the best way possible to teach our online and actually create value in the process. Just remember that there's so much information that's readily available to our students, at their fingertips and with a couple of mouse clicks. And so this really has provided a catalyst for thinking about the shifting role of an educator to ensure that we educators continue to add value in our students' education. The remote learning under lockdown has also shown us that there could be a flexibility, in fact, in how education is delivered. And we could be thinking in the future about alternatives to more traditional educational formats and structures. I've had conversations with both educators and parents who actually say that their students or children are actually flourishing in this remote learning environment. This could potentially lead to the birth of a more permanent remote learning options for students who actually prefer perhaps such an educational experience. One thing that has really come through is that even for the tech-saturated generations of Z and Alpha, they are craving social interaction and physical experiences away from their devices. This has been perhaps the biggest challenge for educators to try and address through these online platforms through the lockdown. It also emphasizes, I think, the need and the deep importance to maintain face-to-face interaction in a student's educational experience. Secondly, I think this pandemic has made us think about what we're educating our students for. So there's been a lot of research and discussion around what the skills of the future would be. These include higher cognitive skills of entrepreneurship, creativity, as well as innovation, as well as social and emotional intelligence skills, including resilience, adaptability, and having a growth mindset. So COVID-19 has really demonstrated that these skills, especially around resilience, adaptability, and having a growth mindset, are absolutely crucial to being able to navigate the current pandemic, as well as what lies ahead. The virus has also really demonstrated the interconnectedness, if you like, of the world that we live in, and the skills needed to work collaboratively and effectively across these differences are so crucial to solving some of the biggest challenges that we as humanity face. At the tertiary level, I think it's exemplified the need for more interdisciplinary education to be able to address the most pressing issues of our time, as well as to come up with the most creative solutions that involve these interdisciplinary areas. What is really interesting also to note in this area is that with important grade 12 exams, for example, being cancelled, universities are having to reshape their admission processes and criteria. And if they're able to make good admission decisions, it begs the question of the role of final exams and the need perhaps to shift what we are teaching towards skills that are really needed for the future, as well as assessing students on a different set of more relevant criteria. Finally, and this is possibly, I think, the most important one, COVID-19 has shown us that we really need to address some very serious issues in the education industry. This pandemic has really brought to light the inequality, if you'd like, in both the quality as well as the accessibility to education globally. And it's also highlighted the digital divide that we see that seems to exist across the world. With the need to achieve the UN Sustainability Development Goal number 4 to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education for all within the next decade, it really requires various public as well as private institutions to come together to really address how we can achieve this, to make our educational systems more resilient, inclusive, as well as equitable for all globally. I do feel that we stand at a unique point in human history right now to really define what education would look like for future generations, for Generation Alpha, but beyond that, in a post-COVID world. This presents many opportunities as well as many challenges that we as an industry must address. And this will require the various stakeholders in the educational sector to come together to think really hard and honestly about these issues, and then take the necessary actions to address them. And I'd like to leave you with a quotation by Nelson Mandela that I think is really important for us to keep in mind as we think about what education is going to look like for the future. Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And thank you for having me.